Daniel chapter 4. Daniel chapter 4, when you find that, please stand with me for the reading of God's Word. Daniel chapter 4, we'll start by reading the first 3 verses here in our series through the book of Daniel. Made it to Daniel chapter 4. Daniel chapter 4, and we'll start reading at verse 1. Daniel chapter 4 and verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar the king, unto all people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. I thought it good to show the signs and wonders that the high God hath wrought toward me. How great are his signs, and how mighty are his wonders. His king is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. And this evening's message is be humble or be humbled. Be humble or be humbled. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for your word and for this really strange story. But we see the truth of this story as told himself by Nebuchadnezzar. And we just pray that you would help us to learn from it, to be challenged, encouraged, and helped. And may you work in each heart by the preaching of your word in the way that you desire. In Jesus' name, amen. You may be seated. We've already seen King Nebuchadnezzar's pride on display here in the book of Daniel, and going back and forth between, I'm going to give glory to God, and then on the other hand, no, he's lifting himself up. He's building a statue for himself to be worshipped and representing him and his kingdom, and he's threatening to throw, and he actually didn't just threaten, he did throw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fiery furnace, but then at the end of in the end of chapter 3, he's making a decree that nobody should speak anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or there'll be great bad things that come upon them. And so we've already seen how prideful Nebuchadnezzar can be, and we're going to see another big example of this in chapter 4, just with a stranger turn than chapter 3. Now in chapter 3, that was a miraculous thing, what God did for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But what happens in chapter 4, very strange turn, and we're going to go through this chapter here tonight. Now first, Nebuchadnezzar gives an introduction to what to this account, what he's going to be retelling what happened to him. And he says, Nebuchadnezzar the king. Now, a commentator pointed out that he didn't really toot his own horn very much in this at all in this introduction. He just says, Nebuchadnezzar the king. Nebuchadnezzar the king. He didn't talk about how great his kingdom was. He didn't talk about how wonderful he is. He didn't say Nebuchadnezzar the most high king or Nebuchadnezzar the greatest king. He just says Nebuchadnezzar the king. Unto all people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. Now this is a rather tranquil Nebuchadnezzar. Different tone from Nebuchadnezzar than what we've seen. Different tone from Nebuchadnezzar than what we saw as he's enraged at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in chapter 3. He's just saying, peace be multiplied unto you. I thought it good to show the signs and wonders that the high God hath wrought toward me. And there's an attitude of humility and giving glory to God here in his introduction. He's about to tell the story of how he came to be that way. And he wanted to talk about God's signs and wonders because he thought it would be a good thing to do. That's just simply what he thought. He said, I thought it good to show the signs and wonders that the high God hath wrought toward me. He said, I think this is a good thing for me to be telling all of you this. You need to pay attention to this. This is an important thing I have to say here. Not because of himself, but because he's actually magnifying God, exalting God in what he does. How great are his signs and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. Now this is an important statement from Nebuchadnezzar because it was Nebuchadnezzar who was prideful, puffed up about his own kingdom, thinking his kingdom's the greatest. He's the one. But now as we see now as he's telling this story, he's got a different attitude. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. His dominion is from generation to generation. Now that's a change from what he said in chapter 3. Who is that God who shall deliver you out of my hand? That's what he said in chapter. That's what he said to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Who is that God? Rhetorical question. Basically, there's no God. Your God's not going to be able to deliver you out of my hand, because after all, I am King Nebuchadnezzar. I am that powerful king. And so we see starting in verse 4, his dream and Daniel's interpretation. This takes up the bulk of the chapter. Verse 4, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in mine house and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream which made me afraid, and the thoughts upon my bed and the visions of my head troubled me. Therefore made I a decree to bring in all the wise men of Babylon before me, that they might make known unto me the interpretation of the dream. Then came in the magicians, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers, and I told the dream before them, but they did not make known unto me the interpretation thereof. Interesting, couple things that are interesting here. One is Nebuchadnezzar could remember this dream. The one, as we see back at the beginning of the book a few chapters ago, he couldn't remember the dream. And that was to show God's power, that Daniel knew the one true God, that he could reveal the dream and the interpretation, basically making the false prophets, or his magicians, and to say false prophets for just as a general term, they were his false prophets, the magicians, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and he was making them look bad. But this time, God wanted the dream to be stuck in Nebuchadnezzar's head. There's a certain purpose for this, because the dream would be fulfilled, and it was going to be very clear. Nebuchadnezzar would have no doubt what would happen, or that this was the interpretation of the dream, that what happened is the fulfillment of the dream. And they couldn't. Now, the other interesting part of this is that the astrologers, magicians, Chaldeans, and the soothsayers, that he went to them first. He went to them first. Now, he's already had enough exposure to Daniel and his God, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and their God, the one true God, and yet he doesn't go to Daniel. He goes back to the same ones he had gone to before. For whatever reason, they were the ones that represented their pagan religions, their idolatry, and that was what they were steeped in there. So he's going back to them. Verse 8, but at the last Daniel came in before me, whose name was Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And before him I told the dream, saying, O Belteshazzar, master of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in thee. And so he's recognizing there's something different about Daniel and who he worships, even though Nebuchadnezzar did not know him personally at this point. And no secret troubleth thee. Tell me the visions of my dream that I have seen, and the interpretation thereof. Thus were the visions of mine head in my bed. I saw, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and the height thereof was great. The tree grew and was strong, and the height thereof reached unto heaven, and all the sight thereof to the end of all the earth. The leaves thereof were fair, and the fruit thereof much, and in it was meat for all. The beasts of the field had a shadow under it, and the fowls of the heaven dwelt in the boughs thereof, and all flesh was fed of it. So this is a very good tree, a very plentiful tree. A tree that the birds like, a tree that the animals like. And, just think of, I picture this. I picture a nice green grassy meadow, and I see this very with a stream running through it, and then this tree growing up near the rivers of water, and that's what I picture. I don't know that's what he saw in his dream. That's just what I picture. We don't see all those details. But I picture this just very fruitful plant, because it says it was a very plentiful, fruitful, good tree, healthy tree, and very beneficial for the animals and the birds. I saw in the visions of my head upon my bed, in verse 13, and behold, a watcher and an holy one came down from heaven. He cried aloud and said thus, hew down the tree, and cut off his branches, shake off his leaves, and scatter his fruit. Let the beasts get away from under it, and the fowls from his branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump of his roots in the earth, even with the band of iron and brass, in the tender grass of the field, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts in the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from man's, and let a beast's heart be given unto him, and let 7 times pass over him. This matter is by the decree of the watchers, and demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men. This dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now thou, O Belteshazzar, declare the interpretation thereof, for as much as all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known unto me the interpretation, but thou art able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in thee. So he did attribute to Daniel. He said he knew there was something different about Daniel. So why did he go back to the others first? Maybe it was just a test again. Can they actually interpret this dream? I'm going to give him another shot here. We don't necessarily know the motivation, but we see that he does attribute to Daniel something different. That he had confidence that Daniel was going to be able to interpret the dream. So God definitely made this dream vivid in Nebuchadnezzar's mind. He wanted it to be very vivid in his mind. In verse 19, then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for 1 hour, and his thoughts troubled him. Now this is Daniel here. Now Daniel had already given Nebuchadnezzar some pretty heavy stuff with the statue and the kingdoms and all of that. That's some pretty heavy stuff. But even with this dream, this interpretation, Daniel was amazed. He was just in amazement at what this dream meant. It says he was astonished for 1 hour, and his thoughts troubled him. I mean, think about when you witness something or you hear something, you see that, and you just stop and you ponder this for a while. You're very troubled about what you're witnessing or what you're hearing. That was what Daniel was going through at that point in time. And he said, middle of verse 19, the king spake and said, Belteshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation thereof trouble thee. So look, Daniel, don't be troubled. He just wants to know what this means. And notice Belteshazzar's answer. He said, my lord, the dream be to them that hate thee, and the interpretation thereof to thine enemies. So Daniel, he was amazed at what the dream meant, but his response was one of submission to the king and one of respect to the king. One of respect that here he's there in Babylon. Remember, he was taken captive. He was forced to go to Babylon. But he did not take this opportunity, oh boy, Nebuchadnezzar's finally getting what's coming to him. He didn't have that attitude even about the king who was responsible for the conquest of his people, of his land, and taking him captive. He didn't have that attitude. Look, my Lord, the dream be to them that hate thee. In other words, that this is what those who hate you want to come upon you. But Daniel was not of that number. And the interpretation thereof to thine enemies, the tree that thou sawest, which grew and was strong, whose height reached unto the heaven, and the sight thereof to all the earth, whose leaves were fair, and the fruit thereof much, and in it was meat for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and upon whose branches the fowls of the heaven had their habitation. It is thou, O king, that art grown and become strong, for thy greatness is grown and reacheth unto heaven, and thy dominion to the end of the earth. And Babylon was the pinnacle of the kingdoms. We've seen that before, and we talked about that before in the previous messages. And it was an amazing kingdom. And so, from a human perspective, Nebuchadnezzar you would say, boy, he has a place to be proud of his kingdom. But the problem was, it was an elevation of himself, and it wasn't an elevation of God, who had allowed him to have that kingdom. And verse 23, and whereas the king saw a watcher and holy one coming down from heaven, and saying, hew the tree down and destroy it, and leave the stump of the roots thereof in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass, and the tender grass of the field, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts of the field, till 7 times pass over him. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which is come upon my lord the king. That they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and they shall wet thee with the dew of heaven, until 7 times shall pass over thee, till thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. And whereas they commanded to leave the stump of the tree roots, thy kingdom shall be sure unto thee, after that thou shalt have known that the heavens do rule. Wherefore, O king, now notice what he says here. So Daniel's attitude, very good attitude. He's being honest with him. Here's the interpretation of the dream. But notice his attitude. He says, wherefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable unto thee. Here's what I'm urging you to do. I'm advising you, counseling you to do this. Break off thy sins by righteousness, and thine iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. If it may be a lengthening of thy tranquility. Look, you need to do what's right. You need to break off your sin. Don't continue in the way you're going. You need to show mercy to the poor. Just basically be a good king. Be a good person. Because if it may be a lengthening of thy tranquility, look, whatever it takes for you to not have to go through this. I don't want you to go through this. And there is a lesson there that when you do right, and particularly for the Christian, for the believer, when you trust Christ as your Savior, you have peace with God. You have peace with God. And here, God was going to be bringing some judgment upon Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel's just urging him, just do right, show mercy, humble yourself, basically do what you need to do to not have to go through this. Now, the dream was going to be fulfilled. God gave him that dream, like this is going to happen. But Daniel's just, if you can lengthen your tranquility, in other words, you can stretch this out a bit, if you can keep this from happening, then that would be a good thing. And we do see, starting in verse 28, the fulfillment of the dream. And it was 12 months later, and God, either he did humble himself for 12 months, or God just gave him some space to humble himself. Maybe he wasn't humble, but we just see it says it 12 months. In verse 28, all this came upon the king Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. The king spake and said. Now notice the contrast here with what's at the beginning of chapter 4, with how he introduced the story he was going to tell. The difference in attitude. Notice this in verse 30. Is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty? Now back in chapter 3, how great are his signs and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom and his dominion is from generation to generation. So those phrases right there, the difference there is the whole reason that God had this come upon Nebuchadnezzar to begin with, because that was in his heart. That was his attitude about himself and his kingdom, and God was not going to let that continue. Verse 31, while the word was in the king's mouth, just instantaneously as he was saying this, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee, and they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over thee, until thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. And so he's taking credit to building his kingdom. He says, you need to learn that God is the one who gives the kingdoms to people. It is not you. It is not the kings themselves that are responsible for it. It's God who allows them, puts them in that position. God's the one who ruleth in the kingdom of men. He's the one who elevates. He's the one who takes down. And the other thing is that God will not share his glory with anyone. And nor does he have to. God is not obligated to share his glory with anyone because he is God. And so Nebuchadnezzar trying to take the glory for himself, God didn't have to share his glory with Nebuchadnezzar, and at that point God decided, no longer am I going to share my glory with Nebuchadnezzar, or no longer am I going to allow him to try to take the glory from me. I'm going to make sure he knows who is truly the ruler. It's the Most High. God is the one who elevates and removes leaders. So important to remember that no matter what kind of people are in charge around the world today, or in America, or locally in the state, whatever it is, just remember God, the God who allowed them to be in that position, is also the God who can take them out at any time. He can remove them at any time. Many times we don't see that happening, but at the same time, often people will allow, or God will allow people to get the leaders they deserve unless He decides to show mercy. And so many times the leaders are a reflection of the people. You have corrupt leadership and ungodly leadership. Well, it is a reflection of a corrupt and ungodly people. And then there are times where God decides, no, I'm going to take I'm going to remove or take this down. And remember Herod in the book of Acts, that Herod was, he was taking credit for himself and setting himself up as God, and God just struck him dead. Did God always do that? No, He didn't always do that. But God, in His time and in His will, if He wants to do that, He can do that. Now think about Antichrist. The Antichrist will be one who sits up saying that he is God, but God doesn't immediately strike Antichrist dead. But He does pour out His judgment upon the earth, and then there's a time when the beast, the Antichrist, will be cast into the lake of fire. And so God's timing His timing is up to Him. It's His prerogative who He elevates, who He puts down, when He puts them down, when He elevates them, and that is so important. And notice that in verse 17, go back there at the end of verse 17, it says, "And setteth up over it." Actually, let me go back a little bit. "The Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever He will, and setteth up over it the basest of men." The basest of men. In other words, and this doesn't always mean that God sets up like terrible people over the kingdoms. But what it means is that these people aren't anything special. These are just men. These are just people. There are men and women in charge around the world. But He sets up over it the basest of men. So recognizing that, Nebuchadnezzar, you yourself are nothing special. God will raise up and put down whoever He chooses, and He'll use whoever He decides to use in the process. The king was still the king, and when this happened to him, he was still the king, but he was not in his right mind. He was still Nebuchadnezzar. He didn't. There were some. It was definitely a supernatural intervention, but it wasn't like. There's some comparisons to animals, but it was that he acted like an animal. He was not in his right mind, and so he was still the king. And what's amazing is that God did preserve His kingdom through these 7 years. The 7 times represents 7 years, and God preserved the kingdom. Now that in of itself was supernatural, because the king, he's driven out and he's not in his right mind, and he's, people, oh boy, that's the king, and he went out from the people in the kingdom there. But God made sure he still had his kingdom. So once again, God preserving that for Nebuchadnezzar shows his control, because in a lot of kingdoms, if the king is in that state, somebody else is going to fill that void. Somebody else is going to fill that vacuum. The king was still the king, not in his right mind. Albert Barnes says, in addition to what is said there, the following cases... Actually, let me go back and read this first. Continue reading here. Verse 33, "The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men and did eat grass as oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven," indicating he must not have had, either he was just simply because he was sleeping outside, or maybe he wasn't as clothed as he normally would have been. "Till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws." And you spend that much time out there living like a beast, your hair is going to be really long, you're going to be quite a sight, and your nails are going to grow pretty long. That's just not a pleasant sight. One time I saw in a Guinness Book of World Records book somebody with the world's longest fingernails. Gross. Sickening. Oh, no. Even just a little bit long. I've seen people who don't necessarily have the greatest personal hygiene, particularly men, and I've seen some men who don't have the greatest personal hygiene, and they'll let their fingernails grow just a little bit longer. They're like, you can just tell, no, they're not taking care of themselves. You can picture them just keep growing. And the world's longest fingernail. But here, his nails like bird's claws, so they're growing out quite a bit here. And hair's grown like eagle's feathers. So, he's very full-haired and just, and really has a lot more of an appearance like a beast of the earth, and eating grass as an oxen. Now, Albert Barnes says, in addition to what is said there, the following cases may be referred to as showing that there is no improbability in supposing that what is here stated actually occurred. And of course, the people who doubt the Bible, the skeptics, the scoffers, will say, all these things are just fairy tales, they're just made up, it's not true. But he then quotes from the extracts. He says, the extracts are taken from the second annual report of the Prison Discipline Society, and they describe the condition of some of the patients before they were admitted into the insane asylum at Worcester. He's talking about Worcester, Massachusetts. And so this is going back, I think Barnes, he lived, how long ago did he live? I don't know, no, but Hunt, this is a long, long time ago. Not in the 1900s. I think maybe he was 18 or 1700. I can't remember now. But so anyway, he says, if these things occurred in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and in the 19th century, so this would have been the 1800s, and in the 19th century of the Christian era, there is nothing incredible in supposing that a similar thing may have occurred in ancient pagan Babylon. And so then he quotes from this report. Number 1, had been in prison 28 years when he was brought to the institution. During 7 years he had not felt the influence of fire, and many nights he had not lain down for fear of freezing. He had not been shaved for 28 years, and had been provoked and excited by the introduction of hundreds to see the exhibition of his raving. Number 2, had been in one prison 14 years. He was naked, his hair and beard grown long, and his skin so entirely filled with the dust of charcoal as to render it impossible from its appearance to discover what nation he was of. He was in the habit of screaming so loud as to annoy the whole neighborhood, and was considered a most dangerous and desperate man. Number 3, an old man of 70 years of age or more had been chained for 25 years and had his chain taken off but once in that time. Number 4, a female had so long been confined with a short chain as wholly to lose the use of her lower limbs. Her health had been materially impaired by confinement. She was unable to stand and had not walked for years. Number 8, had been 10 years without clothes, a most inconceivably filthy and degraded being, exceedingly violent and outrageous. Number 9, another female, exceedingly filthy in her habits, had not worn clothes for 2 years, during which time she had been confined in a filthy cell, destitute of everything like comfort, tearing everything in pieces that was given her. Number 10, had been insane 8 years, almost the whole of the time in jail and in a cage. And so the point of that is he's pointing out, look, this account of Nebuchadnezzar may sound outrageous, but listen to how outrageous those stories are, these accounts from the 18th century in Massachusetts. So this account here of Nebuchadnezzar, him not being in his right mind and going out and living like the beasts of the fields and taking on more of that appearance of the beasts of the field, that is perfectly plausible. That is perfectly reasonable that happened. But we see the king's change of heart. King's change of heart. Verse 34, and at the end of the days I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me, and I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing, and he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say unto him, what doest thou? So he's exalting the majesty, the sovereignty of God, the kingship of God, that he is the ruler, So the chapter ends the way it begins, with Nebuchadnezzar exalting the God of heaven. A lot of the same words there that he's using. Verse 36, at the same time my reason returned unto me. So there we see that he was not of the right mind. He really had gone insane. And for the glory of my kingdom, mine honor and brightness returned unto me, and my counselors and my lords sought unto me, and I was established in my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added unto me. Now look at verse 37, just profound here. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth, and his ways judgment, and those that walk in pride he is able to abase. That's why the title of the message is Be Humble or Be Humbled. All those that walk in pride he is able to abase. And now he's extolling and honoring the King of heaven. All his works are truth. Now this is different. When you look at the wording here, you get the tone. You can get the tone from reading things and quote what people are quoting. And there were times previous chapters, where Nebuchadnezzar is giving some credit in regard to the God of Daniel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that he's saying some good things about their God. But in this case, chapter 4, with how he ends up, he got thoroughly humbled, and we see a change of heart in Nebuchadnezzar's life. Just a more thorough, if you want to say, humility, reverence for God, his praise, extolling and honoring the King of heaven, all whose works are truth and his ways judgment. That's pretty profound, coming from a King Nebuchadnezzar. And those that walk in pride he's able to abase. He had, you could say, he had undergone a literal transformation. Physically speaking, but then in his own heart he had undergone a transformation, because, and I would hope that after 7 years you live like that would be enough. But you know what we see during the 7-year tribulation period, what's going to come upon the earth, there are going to be people who stay hard-hearted. There are going to be people who stay prideful. There are going to be people who stay rebellious against God. Thankfully, Nebuchadnezzar was not one of them. God will get his glory one way or another. It doesn't always happen immediately, but one way or another, at some point in time, God will get glory. And it is best, just like for Nebuchadnezzar here, it would have been best for him to humble himself rather than being humbled. Be careful what you wish for. You know, God, would you humble me? Would you teach me humility? Well, be careful about that. Now, I don't think he's going to do to you what he did to Nebuchadnezzar, but it's better for us to have a contrite heart, to have a heart of humility before God that is of our own volition, and not God then bringing things into our lives in order to humble us. But I'm thankful that he does, because if I'm dealing with a prideful spirit, I wouldn't necessarily want God to leave me in that place. So we should look at it as a good thing for his children when he chastens them, that it's a good thing that he does do things to prick us, to humble us, to bring us lower, so that then we can humble ourselves and give glory to him. But the challenge with pride is that it seems to like to return. And we saw that in Nebuchadnezzar's life. He'd exalt himself, and then he would give glory to the God of Daniel, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so it took God getting Nebuchadnezzar's attention in a really big way to say, look, you're trying to put yourself in God-like status here. And I'm just going to teach you that you aren't God. And it took a very strange way, but in a very serious way, a very life-altering way to do it. But pride likes to return. There are times we get humble. We might humble ourselves before God, and we realize, I'm right where I want to be. And then we get pride. We can get prideful because we got humble. Or we were humble, but then all of a sudden, our minds change. We get prideful again. That's not something you just all of a sudden humble yourself and then you live the rest of your life humble. No, it's an ongoing battle. Pride was the sin of Lucifer. He fell from heaven, that he was going to be like the Most High, and that cost him his place, his position as the anointed cherub. One of the aspects of the world system is the pride of life. So a very major part, pride, very, very important thing. And what does the Bible say? Yea, these 6 things that the Lord hate, yea, 7 are an abomination unto him. And what's the first one? A proud look. A proud look. Now, our natural tendency is to face the temptation to be in pride even after we humble ourselves and give God the glory. And so sometimes God will do something in our lives. He'll bring us through a tough time, or he'll bless us in some way, or basically we go through and notice, and I think it's similar to Nebuchadnezzar. In the moment He made impulsive statements. Ooh, wow, now because he saw what happened, oh, God is the God of heaven. This was more of a thorough transformation in Nebuchadnezzar's life. We can see based on how he's explaining this, how he's giving glory to the God of heaven. But before, he wasn't that way. He was just moment by moment, kind of very fickle, back and forth, and he was gone from elevating himself to then giving some credit to God, but it really wasn't coming from a really deep, genuine heart, humbled heart. And God will bring us through something, or He'll bless us in some way, and while we're going through that trial, if we're going through trial, then God brings us through, and we're humble through it, and we're seeking the Lord, and then we get going through that trial. Maybe things get better. Maybe the circumstances get better. And all of a sudden, the person who had to just really rely on God from day to day because of that trial, that tribulation you were going through, and then all of a sudden that's gone. God delivers you from that. Then you get to think, oh, I'm feeling pretty good. I'm feeling pretty good about myself. And we have a tendency then to not stay in that humble state. We get to thinking, oh, I've got this now. I've got life handled. Because now I'm feeling pretty good. I got out of my circumstances that was leading me to rely more on the Lord. So I've got life now, and people can not necessarily maybe not say those words, although some people get pretty close, but they have that attitude, and we get prideful. It's possible for us to get prideful because now we think we can handle life. We think we can handle life. Paul's thorn in the flesh. For whatever reason, God decided He wasn't going to let Paul's thorn in the flesh be healed. He wasn't going to deliver him from that thorn in the flesh. And the reason was that my grace is sufficient for thee, my strength is made perfect in weakness. In other words, God wanted Paul to experience His grace on an ongoing basis through that thorn in the flesh. That Paul may have maybe gotten a bit prideful after that. He might have been feeling pretty good about himself. Hey, things are going really well now. And then he's not as reliant on the grace of God. So we need to be careful of that. That when God brings us through something and things are going better, our circumstances change, or He blesses us in some way, that we remain humble in giving Him the glory because of what He did. Not forgetting what He did and then all of a sudden just going on with life and thinking we've got life now, but giving God glory for what He did. So being humble through the circumstances of life that are difficult and trials, and relying on the Lord to help us through each day. And then when things get better, then being humble in giving Him the glory and recognizing that we could be on the doorstep of some more trials. I better just stay humble. And I need God every day. How much do we need God? A few verses here. Deuteronomy, you don't have to turn here, but Deuteronomy 8:2, and thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble thee and to prove thee, to know what was in thine heart, whether thou wouldest keep His commandments or no. 2 Chronicles 7:14, if my people which are called by my name shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. And I realize this is that was speaking of Israel or Judah, but it shows us the criteria of what God will bless. Regardless, it was for Israel, but if my people, and that was His people Israel, which are called by my name. But for our application today, we are God's people, we are His children, and if for God to heal the land, it requires believers to humble themselves, to pray, to seek His face, turn from their wicked ways. Some people like to skip that last part, turn from their wicked ways. Oh yes, well, if you humble yourself and pray, seek my face, that involves, go right along with that, it's turning from their wicked ways. What's that? That's revival. That's getting right with God, getting back to God. Then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. And that's what we need today. But how many, the a lot of churches in this day and age, there's a great spirit of pride that comes from the churches, from God's people who profess to be God's people at the very least. And God's not going to heal a land with that. Proverbs 16:19 says, "Better it is to be of an humble spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud." So better to be humble and not have as much than to, oh yeah, you might be wealthy, you might have all kinds of material things, but you're hanging around the prideful people. That's your in crowd. You're the in crowd with the prideful people. So Isaiah 57:15, "For thus saith the high and lofty one that inhabiteth eternity, whose name is holy. I dwell in the high and holy place, with him also that is of a contrite and humble spirit, to revive the spirit of the humble and to revive the heart of the contrite ones." Matthew 23:12, "And whosoever shall exalt himself shall be abased, and he that shall humble himself shall be exalted." 1 Peter 5:5, "Likewise ye younger, submit yourselves unto the elder. Yea, all of you be subject one to another, and be clothed with humility. For God resisteth the proud, and giveth grace to the humble." Now I just want to say this, that being humble is not the same as being down on yourself. Being down on yourself. That's actually a false humility. That's actually that's the other side. That's the other side of the pride coin. That's the other side of the pride coin. Being humble just simply means I am not elevating myself to a higher level than what is rightfully mine. It's an honest assessment of who I am compared to who God is. It's putting God in His rightful place and putting me in my rightful place, being under God. It's not putting myself down and just showing to everybody else, oh boy, I'm just, there's people who are just they're self-condemning, or they'll talk to others and they'll and in a purposeful way, in trying not to be humble. Trying to be humble, but it's not really, because it's still about us. It's still about us. I know one of the attributes, there are good attributes. Every family has good and bad attributes. And you might be able to pick some out about your relatives, good and bad. But one of the things that I grew up around, not in my immediate family, but some extended family on one side of the family, was just a lot of criticism. A lot of being critical, and then making fun of other people. A lot of making fun. Not necessarily making fun to people's face, but just that whole attitude of making fun of other people. And now these people would not have always, these relatives would not have always come across as being as prideful people. If you were just to meet them in the store or just to see them around, they wouldn't necessarily have this maybe high and lofty look about them, like they're all that. But what happens is, if someone is overly critical of others, that probably means, well, that is an indication of pride, but it probably means they aren't thinking too much of themselves. They're putting themselves down. They've got to criticize someone else to bring them down. And so that in of itself is an indication of pride. So that they're not necessarily bragging on themselves. We would think, oh yeah, that's being prideful. That's being of a haughty spirit. But it's a constant criticism or making fun of other people, and trying to put other people down is the same as trying to elevate ourselves. You're just simply, instead of making yourself higher, you're trying to just bring people down lower. But it's the same thing. And so we see, as I read in 1 Peter 5:5, be clothed with humility. For God resisteth the proud and giveth grace to the humble. Being humble means being willing to admit when we're wrong. It means being willing to apologize when we are wrong. It means being willing to make necessary changes when we are wrong. And then, when we are right, it means not thinking highly of ourselves when we are right. It's not rubbing it in, oh, I was right, no, that's a prideful spirit. We must be clothed with humility. That should be emanating from our lives. Our very being is that is our life, is a life of humility. God resisteth. And so, do you want, I don't want God resisting me. I want God to give me grace. I need more grace. Well, very clearly, He gives grace to the humble. So you need some power, you need some ability, some divine favor for each day. Well, then we need to humble ourselves. Because He resists the proud. Stiff arm. The king had a change of heart. In his case, he had to be humbled. But we have a choice each and every day. We can be humble or be humbled. Because God knows how. God knows how to bring some things in to tweak us a little bit, to bring us a little bit low a bit. One preacher said it this way about their children, about and issues with parents and children, and how parents will say to the child, they go into church and the children are doing things and that might be considered embarrassing, or just they're not misbehaving, or whatever the case might be with their behavior, and the child will say, you just embarrassed me. And he said, well, you probably needed it. Why? Because there's a difference between correcting children's behavior because they're not doing right, or teaching them mature, just helping them along in their growth and their maturity. There's a difference between correcting behavior and teaching them what is right than making it all about me. But you just embarrassed me, so I'm upset with you because you embarrassed me. Well, that's a prideful spirit. So as parents, there's times children do things and we say, oh boy, I can't believe they did that. That makes me look bad. That makes me look. I wonder what everybody's thinking about me as a parent. They must think I'm a terrible parent. When, if we operate in humility, we think we just need to let go of those thoughts, and we deal with the matters at hand when it comes to what needs to be dealt with. And there was I'll finish with this. I told this joke on Wednesday night, and I think it might have had something to do with our lesson, or maybe it didn't, but. There was I think it did have to do with our going through Ecclesiastes on Wednesday nights, but there was a man who he was in a church and he passed away, and the pastor was going to preach his funeral. And this guy was a wicked guy. I mean, he was wicked as the day is long, and the pastor was going to preach his funeral, and a family member came up. The guy's brother said, I'd like you to get up and say during his funeral just how wonderful this man was, that he was such a saint. And the pastor said, look, I got to be honest. He says, no, I want you to do this. And so the pastor got up during the funeral and he said, oh, this guy was this way, this way, this way, and lists off all the ways he was such a wicked man. And he said, but compared to his brother here, he was a saint. That guy got humbled, as this joke goes. He would be humbled sitting there eating humble pie. But we have that choice each day. And if we're going to have God's grace in our lives, if we're going to have God's favor and His help and guidance and strength through the days, we need to take the initiative to humble ourselves and be humble. Not with some false humility of, oh, look at how humble I am, everybody. That's pride. But just simply in our heart of hearts, as Nebuchadnezzar, the way that he spoke, the way that he conducted himself after that, he was humble. But he had to be humbled. But we also, at the times when we get prideful, we should be thankful to God when He does humble us, when He does bring things into our lives to teach us humility, because then that way we can give glory to Him and we can get closer to Him. But we need to learn the lessons through that we should, of our own volition, of our own heart, be humble.